So we're now up to Parshat Terumah. So just to situate ourselves and to do some review as we always do, let's take a look back a little bit of what we've discussed the past couple of weeks, because Terumah really is born out of the context before it, what comes before it. So before we got to Parshat Terumah, we had before it Yitro and Mishpatim. So in Yitro, we talked about the giving of the Torah, and we focused specifically on the initial plan of the giving of the Torah, where God says at the sound of the shofar, everyone's going to go up the mountain. And we said perhaps there was some sort of initial plan that was more democratic. We know the Midrash says initially the Jews were supposed to hear all 10 commandments, and then they couldn't, so they only heard 2. And this is really, we saw based on the Psukim, that the people say we can't stand to hear it from God anymore. So we said maybe there was an initial plan of how Har Sinai was supposed to go, and then maybe a later plan. And that's how it actually went, where the Jews were a little bit more removed, and Moshe served more as an intermediary. Then from there, we looked at what came right after Har Sinai, the inevitable Har Sinai that ended up being distanced, removed, and hearing only through Moshe. From there, we looked at Parshat Mishpatim. And we saw that towards the end of Mishpatim, we have a second ritual, a second ceremony surrounding a mountain with the Jewish people, seeming very similar to Har Sinai. But yet when we look at the content and the textual content of it, it really parallels more the Akedat Yitzchak. And we talked about how really perhaps what we have here is a parallel or a foil more to Sinai. That there's 2 Sinaitic, 2 revelations. One of them is intellectual, based in fear, understanding. And the other, though, is based in love. It's based off of Ahava, Ahavas Hashem. So whereas the first one, there's an emphasis on the charada and the trembling and the fear. The latter one has an emphasis on this Ahava and the love, and it even parallels the Akedat Yitzchak, this idea of personal sacrifice or devotion. So that's where we left off. We now have some sort of sense of the Har Sinai, of the revelation moment that took place in the middle of Shemot. Perhaps the point of Shemot, one of the most important parts of what we're building towards here in the Exodus. But all that brings us to Terumah. And with Terumah, we shift now to arguably the third part, the third piece in the book of Exodus. Part 1, the Exodus. Part 2, receiving the Torah. And then arguably part 3, the rest of Exodus, the rest of the book of Shemot, is about the Mishkan, or maybe a little bit more broadly than just the Mishkan, more broadly than just the tabernacle, but developing the tabernacle and the religious and national infrastructure needed for the Jewish people going forward. And that's what we're up to now. So we now come to this question of the tabernacle and its construction. That's Parshat Terumah. So we look in source 1 and we see the opening of Terumah is as follows. V'yidaber Hashem Moshe lemor. And Hashem spoke to Moses saying, Daber b'nei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, v'chuli Terumah. Take for me a tithe, or we see here that the Sepharia translated as a gift. Me'et kol ish asher yidvenu libo, from any man who would give up his heart, tikhu et terumati, take a gift for me. And then the Torah goes on to list specific gifts that God needs. He needs gold to build these things for the tabernacle, silver for these, certain jewels and diamonds and furs, all kinds of things that are needed for the construction of the tabernacle, the construction of the Mishkan. But what we see here is that immediately after we finish Parshat Mishpatim, we have the covenant of the Agunot, the Brit Agunot, some sort of ceremony in the mountains. We then immediately transition into fundraising for the Mishkan. That's the next step in the story. Now, given that the story, the narrative goes from Har Sinai to Brit Agunot, to this ceremony in the mountain, straight into the fundraising for the Mishkan, one would naturally assume the normal thought, the obvious assumption would be that what's going on here is a chronology, a strict chronology, that immediately following Har Sinai, we have the commandment to build the Mishkan. That's the simplest way to understand what's going on. Moshe goes up, and then the Jews get the commandment to build the Mishkan in that order. So if you look here, for example, the Ramban seems to take, as he usually does, the most simple approach in the chronology of what's going on, and he understands we have here a story that follows closely on the heels of Har Sinai, of Sinai receiving the Torah. So the Ramban writes, V'hinei heim kdoshim, ru'yim sheyeh behem mikdash lahashrot shchinato b'neihem. And they, holy ones, referring to the Jewish people who had just received the Torah, just experienced the revelation of Sinai, so those holy Jews deserved a temple to house God's presence amongst them. ולכן ציווה תחילה על דבר המשכן שיהיה לו בית בתוכם מקודש לשמו. Therefore, God commanded the Jews right after the giving over of the Torah at Sinai that they should make him a temple, and that temple should be dedicated to his name. And there he'll speak to Moses and command the Jewish people. And the main goal of this Mishkan is to provide a place for the Shekhinah to rest. And that is in the Aron, in the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. We know that most interior, most sacred space is where God's presence was said to rest in the Mishkan. So says the Ramban, we always needed a place for God's presence to rest, but it wasn't until now that the Jewish people were holy enough to merit God's presence living with them. But by the time they get to Sinai, we know for example, the rabbis, metaphorically, literally, they talk about how there are 49 levels of Terumah rather. And we know that parallels very nicely the 49 days between Pesach and Shavuos. It connects to the sphere, etc. But part of what the rabbis are touching on, the metaphor, literal or not there, is that the Jewish people are at a very low level spiritually, and Har Sinai represented a peak. Har Sinai, the Sinaitic revelation, that was some sort of spiritual high, some sort of spiritual peak. So says the Ramban, since they just experienced that spiritual peak, these Jews are Kedoshim, they're holy people, and they're going to take that holiness and use it to now merit a temple with God living amongst them. So says the Ramban, this was always the plan, but now we finally get to the point where we're holy enough to facilitate it. But Soda Mishkan, and the secret, the key to this Mishkan, this tabernacle, Shia Kavod Asher Shachin al Har Sinai, Shachin alav B'nistar. And the idea is that the kavod, the honor of God that was upon Har Sinai should also rest upon this tabernacle, B'nistar, but somehow a little more secretly, a little more reserved. But what we see is, according to the Ramban, the chronology is intentional because the chronology emphasizes the theme. The Har Sinai is supposed to set us up for the Mishkan. Because one, Har Sinai makes us holy enough, gives us the means necessary to reach the spiritual heights of living so close to God, of having a tabernacle where God's presence is embodied. And secondly, in addition to the heights of Har Sinai, what we have here is a thematic connection that the Mishkan should be carrying on Har Sinai. It should be carrying on the Kedusha, the spirituality of Har Sinai, because as we see, the point is that the Shekhinah, the presence that was invoked at the Sinaitic revelation, should be continued all the way to the tabernacle. So that's the position of the Ramban. And I think it goes without saying that the Ramban is the Pshat. He's a simple understanding. When you read the Torah, when you read through the Bible, you assume what happened in the order it's presented. So says the Ramban for good reason. What we have is a literal story. First the Jews go the first time and they get the Torah. Then they're commanded with the first giving of the Torah about the Mishkan. And then what we'll see later what happens is that they sin with the golden calf, the Egal HaZahav, and they have to get the Torah a second time. So according to this chronology, the initial commandment to build the Mishkan took place when Moses first ascended the mountain. All of this is chronologically in order. And just to emphasize that the Ramban is well-founded, he doesn't even need our proofs because what he's saying is the Pshat, is a simple approach. But really at the core of the Ramban is this idea that the temple should have always existed. This was always part of the plan, and we knew that. It was just waiting till we got to the right point. So some evidence for this idea in the Ramban is that earlier on in the Book of Shemot, earlier on in the history of the Jewish people, we have perhaps a very oblique reference to the idea of building a temple to God. So for example, many of the rabbis and commentators point to a verse from Az Yashir, from the Song of the Sea. So if you look in source 3, we say in Az Yashir, Tiviyima v'titeima b'har nachlatcha, you'll bring them and plant them in your mountain. Machon l'shiftecha p'alta Hashem, the place you made to dwell in, Hashem, Nikdash Hashem konenu yadecha, the sanctuary of God which your hands established. So we talk about God bringing people to his place, his machon, his institute, and then beyond that, his mikdash, his holy place. And says Rashi here, even though he's not the one who abides by the Ramban's theory, Rashi says, reflecting the rabbis and the Midrash, what's the machon l'shiftecha? What's God's place? Mikdash Shamata, God's abode, God's temple down below. Mechuvan connected Kisei Shamala, which parallels God's seat, God's throne up above. In other words, we see already at the moment of Exodus, the theological birth, perhaps, of the Jewish nation. When they're leaving Egypt, the Jewish people see God, see his miracles. At Yetziat Mitzrayim, what was the plan? To have a temple. the Jews were so excited, they said, we'll build a temple to God. So that seems great. The plan was always to build a temple. We waited till we had a Torah, till we had a reason to build a temple. We had a religion to build it around. And now we're going to build a temple. That is the position of the Ramban, and I would argue the Pshat, the simplest approach. But what's fascinating is that while this is the position of the Ramban, while this is the Pshat, while this is what you will get out of reading the words, for some reason, this is one of those examples where Rashi and many of the other commentators in the Torah invoke a biblical methodological concept known as Ein Mukdam U'Me'uchar B'Torah. There's no chronology in the Torah. Events, stories, and the narrative are not being presented chronologically, but rather thematically, says Rashi. So according to that theory, which Rashi, as we'll see inside, subscribes to, what we're dealing with here is not necessarily a story that immediately follows on the heels of Moshe's first time going up the mountain. And this, of course, is textually a weaker claim, because textually you have to say that the story, the book, which is presented as a narrative, is presented as a story, isn't giving over the information in narrative chronology. So of course this isn't impossible, and I think if we all thought about it a little bit, we could probably find times where everybody agrees where the Torah is a little bit out of order for thematic reason. But the question is, how far do we take this principle? How far out of order do we think the Torah is going to be? So that's really the broader meta question. Our example of it is, how do we view the confusing stories surrounding the giving of the Torah? Because we know that we saw inside, when we read Parshat Yitro, that just in Parshat Yitro alone, just in the first giving of the Torah, we have two separate stories of Moshe going up and down the mountain. So we already have a repetition there. Then we know we also have the Brit Agunot, we have the covenant that happens on top of a mountain involving some sort of Sefer HaTorah Hazeh, Sefer HaBrit Hazeh. Then we also know we have the sin of the golden calf, where Moses breaks the luchot and has to go a whole second time. So we have minimally 3 to 4, maybe even 5 separate instances of a covenant with a mountain and the Jewish people receiving something. So it's very hard to keep track of when did which take place, which is first, what's the chronology. It's not very clear. So given that we have a very confused, sort of outdated, sort of confusing chronology where we go forward and then jump back and forward and jump back, first giving of the Torah part 1, first giving of the Torah part 2, we can sort of understand why, of all places, this one makes sense to say, perhaps, in Mukdam Mu'achar, that there is no strict order in the Torah, that indeed, perhaps we're dealing here with an instance where the Torah is out of order. So just to give an example of Rashi subscribing to this theory, we see clearest of all, later on, by the Egel HaZahav, by the golden calf, we see that Rashi says, Ein Mukdam U'Me'uchar B'Torah. There's no early or later, there's no order in the Torah. Ma'aseh ha'egel kodem l'tzivoy melechet ha'mishkan. The creation of the egel, the creation of the golden calf, took place before the commandment to build the tabernacle. Yamim rabim haya, many, many days beforehand. Shahari b'yud zayin b'Tammuz, nishtabru luchot. On the 17th of Tammuz is when the luchot were broken, according to the tradition. V'yom kippurim nitratza kadosh baruch hu Yisrael. And Yom Kippur, the 10th day of Tishrei, is when the Jews finally achieved repentance. The Macharat, the day after, they started building the Mishkan, v'hukam b'echad Nisan, and they finished on Nisan. So he quotes the Midrash Tanchuma that says that the Mishkan was built after Yom Kippur, after the Jews received repentance for the second breaking of the Luchot and for the sin of the golden calf. So according to Rashi, very clearly, we see that the timeline is totally different from the Ramban. We don't have a story that follows after Moshe's first ascent to the mountain, but rather a story that follows after Moshe's second ascent. The first time around, Moshe isn't told anything about a temple, about a tabernacle. He just goes up and gets the Luchot, he gets the 10 Commandments. Then the Jews sin, they build the golden calf. Moshe, out of horror, breaks the Luchot, he breaks the 10 Commandments, and he has to go back up and receive them again. That second time, when he receives the 10 Commandments again, that's when God tells him he should build the temple. That's the position put forth by Rashi, that we are dealing here with a story that is out of order. So, just to give some proof, some credence to Rashi's theory, it's not, well, on the one hand, we said it's not pshat, it's not the simplest read of the verses, it's not without its own textual evidence. It does have its own proof. So, for example, one proof for Rashi's theory is that we know we just read last week for Parshat Shkalim, the section of the Torah that deals with the machzit shekel, the half shekel donation that every Jew of counting who counted for the census had to give for the temple, for the construction of the Mikdash. So we know long term, in the history of the Jewish people, that the census money is given for the construction of a temple. It's given lebedek habayis for the temple funds. What's interesting is that in Kitisa, when we see the very first instance of the Machzor shekel, nowhere does it actually say explicitly that it's being given over for a temple. It just says, "Vaydaber Hashem Moshe lemor." God spoke to Moshe saying, "Kitisa et rosh bnei Yisrael lifkudehem." When you count the Jews, "Natnu ish kofer nafsho l'Hashem b'fkodotam." People should give some sort of redemption. Lo yebem neged b'fkodotam. And there won't be a plague. We can discuss that when we get up to that. Everyone gives a half shekel, b'shekel and kodesh, of these holy shekels, esrim gerah shekel. And then it doesn't go on and tell you what it's for. It just tells you at the end, l'kachta et kesef, you should take this money, hakipurim, which is atoning, me'et b'nei Yisrael, from the Jewish people, v'natata oto al avodat ol moed, and give it to the work of the temple, of the work of the Mishkan. V'yal b'nei Yisrael l'zikaron l'fnei Hashem l'chaper nafshetechem, and it will be a reminder to the Jewish people. So you give it to some vague use for the Ol Moed, for the tabernacle. We're not exactly sure what it is. But what we do see is that it's being used for the tabernacle. The census, in other words, according to Rashi, is being used for the Mishkan. That's the simplest understanding of what's going on here. And if the census is being used for the Mishkan, says, according to the theory of Rashi, it's noteworthy that this doesn't get mentioned until all the way in Parshat Kitisa, right around the time of the Egel HaZahav, of the sin of the golden calf. If really the census was taking with this, if what we're dealing with here wasn't something so intimately tied in fundraising for the construction of the Mishkan, if we weren't dealing with something, or rather the other way around, if it wasn't that the Mishkan was taking place at such a later stage than the first giving of the Torah, from the first time Moshe went up the mountain, then we would have heard about the fundraising efforts for the Mishkan much earlier. So it must be that the fact that this fundraising effort, the census, isn't mentioned in Parshat Terumah, isn't mentioned in Parshat Tetzaveh, it must be it didn't actually take place until after the golden calf, because that's when the plan to actually build the temple took place. That's one proof for Rashi. So far, so good. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions on that? All right. So for example, just to back up, that this is how we see that Rashi understands this. We see that Rashi, on this pasuk, dealing with the donation of the half shekel, he says, "L'manata shenitztavu limnota b'tchila nidvat mishkan acher masa egel." You should learn from here that this commandment took place when the Jews were first commanded to build the tabernacle, which was after the sin of the golden calf. Very clear. And he goes on to explain why that of all times is when the census would be most appropriate, because the Jewish people lost so many lives due to the punishment of the golden calf. So of course, it must be the census is taking place afterwards. We're trying to count how many people are still around, how many people are still alive, and to collect money to build the tabernacle. So that's how Rashi understands, and for sure, to some extent, does seem to be the pshat of Parshat Kitisa. Now, of course, one of the challenges that you might point out is that even according to this understanding, the census is being mentioned before the sin of the golden calf. The sin of the golden calf, the psukim, I believe, are still being mentioned after this mention of the collecting the Machzor shekel. But nonetheless, we have here a much later pushed off iteration, expression of the census. So I think Rashi's camp would say, true, very strictly speaking, even this is before we have a mention of the golden calf. But this is a couple psukim, a few verses before, not several chapters before. So we're getting closer to a chronology here. That would be Rashi's, I think, first textual proof. One more potential textual proof for Rashi is from much later, from Sefer Dvarim. Comes up in Parak Yod, chapter 10 of Deuteronomy and Dvarim. Because in Parak 10 in Dvarim Yod, Moshe, as he does throughout all of Deuteronomy, is giving over his perspective, his teaching of things. And in Dvarim Yod, Moshe goes over his perspective surrounding the chronology and the events surrounding the giving of the Torah. And there Moshe tells us, B'nai Yisrael, so the Jews received the Torah. B'nai Yisrael nasu meverot b'nai Ya'akan Mosra, the Jews traveled for a certain amount of period, fine. And then he tells us in verse 8 here, Be'et hahi, at that moment, Hivdil Hashem et Shevet HaLevi, L'seit et Aron Brit Hashem. Hashem separated the tribe of Levite to carry the Aron of Hashem, La'amod L'fnei Hashem L'sharto, to stand in front of God, U'levarich B'shmo, and to bless his name. So says Moshe, at that moment, the tribe of Levi was designated to have the priests and the Levites descend from it. In other words, according to Moshe, it wasn't until after the giving of the first time he went up to get the Torah, after the first giving of the Torah, where until a much later point, that the Jewish people were told that Kohanim and Leviim, that priests and Levites, would be the ones to service in the Mishkan, to service in the temple. Now, if that's the case, then how can it be Parshat Tetzaveh, which tells us about the clothing that the Kohanim are going to wear, how could that take place right after the giving of the Torah? At the time of the Torah, the Kohanim and Leviim weren't yet designated to be the ones to do service in the temple. So it must be this took place at a later time, and it's just out of order. So that's one more textual proof from the fact that Moshe, in his retelling of the events, says that God didn't pick the Kohanim, God didn't pick the priests until much later, until after they got the Torah, until after they traveled somewhere else. So it must be, even if we didn't want to say first time Moshe went up to Har Sinai, second time Moshe went up to Har Sinai, it must be this commandment to make, for example, clothing for the Kohanim, to make all these vessels for the Kohanim. That must have happened later after the Kohanim were picked to be the ones who served in the temple. So that's one more proof we have for Rashi's theory, a textual proof, not just a thematic or conceptual one, that maybe even the Psukim themselves, maybe even the Torah itself, really is indicating here that what we're dealing with is not a Torah story that's going in order, but a thematic connection to emphasize it. Does that make sense? All right. So now beyond the textual proofs, what we're really dealing with here, the difference between Rashi and Ramban, is not, strictly speaking, just a historical or a factual debate.
So loud.
It's not just a question of, just a reminder to everyone to mute unless you have a question or you're participating. Thank you.
I was reading.
So just as a reminder, so what I was saying is what we're dealing with here is a machlok between Ramban and Rashi. And on a strict level, we have a chronology question. When did the events of the story take place? Did the commandment to build the tabernacle take place after the first time Moses went up to the mountain, or during his first time up on the mountain, the first time he got the Leead? That's our question, and we heralded textual sources on both sides. You can bring scriptural sources to prove anything, as we've shown. Which doesn't mean it's not still Talmud Torah, it's not still important, but that didn't indicate to us anything clear. But what I do want to discuss is why one would stake out one claim versus the other. What is the conceptual stake? What is the actual difference in the story based off of when this takes place? So to that end, I first want to look at Rashi, because I think that's much clearer, that's much more obvious. What are the themes at play if Rashi thinks that we have not a chronology, but a thematic juxtaposition? Well, I think those go without saying. So for example, if you look in source 9, one of the parallels, one of the themes we have here, appears surrounding the Egel Zahav, the construction of the golden calf. So there we see that Aaron is unwillingly forced to be in charge of the project or constructing it. And we see in source 9 as follows, Vayomer Aleim Aaron, Aaron says to the people, Parku nizmei hazahav, asher be'oznei neshechem, b'neichem v'bnotechem, v'yaviu elai. Take out the golden rings that are that your wives, sons, and daughters are wearing. And we know, of course, Chazal say, what a strange thing to ask for. The reason why Aaron asked for that is because these are the younger, more vulnerable groups. So taking their jewelry away would be much harder to part with. This is all a stalling tactic. We know Chazal say that, very interesting, and we can discuss when we get at the Kitisa maybe, it's Egel and Aaron's culpability. But what we do see is a very direct parallel to the construction of the Mikdash, to Terumah. We see gold being called for to be donated from the Jewish people for some religious end. Unfortunately, a corrupted, a perverted religious end, the Egel Zahav, the golden calf, but nonetheless a religious end. And then Parku kol ha'am nizmei hazahav, and the whole nation takes their rings, and despite what Aaron might have thought, they immediately, willingly donate them, and they build a golden calf. But what we see here is we have a parallel between the donations for the Mishkan and a parallel between the donations for the golden calf. And what that allows us to do is to construct a theme, a reason why that parallel would matter. So why would it be that we'd have a parallel between the Mishkan and a parallel between the golden calf? Does anyone want to throw it out there? And any ideas? Why should we have this parallel here?
Is the Mishkan a rectification of?
Beautiful. Exactly what Richard's saying. Now, one conclusion one could get from this is that what we're trying to emphasize here is that the Mishkan is a rectification for the golden calf. And of course, to an extent, we really understand that. that we have a physical manifestation of God's presence, a Mishkan. We have a sin about a physical manifestation of God's presence, the Egel HaZahav. So by saying that we're going to parallel the actions the Jewish people took, what are we saying? God gave the Jewish people an opportunity for tshuva, for repentance and rectification for the sins that they took. So, you Jewish people sinfully donated to construct a golden calf? I'll give you a different project to construct that will be used for my good purposes. Then,
Well, we haven't read the next one. It's just that it comes before the last one.
The next one, source number 10, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, because Aaron says to them, take off your golden rings and all of that. So at Exodus 32, and in Exodus 31, we find out who is designated to.
That's also true. So Lindy's touching on the next source, and I think the next source is another proof that we have a thematic and maybe even textual tie here. Because as Lindy points out in Exodus 31, we see who exactly was charged with constructing the Mishkan, who is the artisan in charge. Re'eh karati b'shem Betzalel, this kid Betzalel. But unusually, we don't just hear his name, and we don't just hear his father's name, and we don't just hear his grandfather's name or his tribe. We hear a whole spelled out thing, Betzalel, ben Uri, ben Chor l'Mata Yehuda. And all the commentators pick up on how strange it is that so much attention is being called to his name, his lineage, his title, etc. So the Chizkuni picks up on this, the fact that the Mishkan, that the tabernacle, is being constructed specifically by Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor, and he points out as follows. Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor, Nizkar Zikno, we mention his grandfather of Shel Betzalel, Chor, his grandfather, Masha Einkin b'Oholiab ben Achisamach. Unlike Oholiab ben Achisamach, who's also involved, we only mention his father, son of Achisamach, Lefisha Nerag b'Maaseh ha'Egel, because Chor was killed in the Maaseh ha'Egel. We know that the rabbis say, picking up from the Psukim, that whereas Aaron gave in to the Jewish crowds, the riotous crowds who wanted to build this Egel HaZahav, Chor stood up and said, no, I won't. He protested against them. And ultimately, because of his protest, Chor was killed. In other words, Chor represented the Jewish opposition, the legitimate opposition to the Egel HaZahav, what could have been the righteous amongst Israel saying, no, we're not going to build this idol. So says the Chizkuni, when by the Mishkan, the first thing we're told is the tabernacle must be built by Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor, we're seeing that it's the camp of Jews who stood up against the Egel HaZahav. Those are the Jews who are being trusted to build the Mishkan. So we see Betzalel is being picked, at least according to the Chizkuni, because of the midrashic significance of Chor. Chor represents or stands in for the opposition to the Egel HaZahav. Betzalel, as his grandson, is the fit person for that. Now, just to point out that while this is the position of the Chizkuni, and not explicitly Rashi, it does help and fit very thematically that the Chizkuni would say this, because in general, the Chizkuni views himself as commenting on and following the tradition of Rashi. So just to drive this home, I brought in a poem from the Chizkuni's own writing, where he says in his own Hakdam, his introduction to his commentary, Va'ani einani k'mishiv al divrei Rabbeinu Shlomo, ela k'mosif al dvarav yarbeha kel Shlomo. I don't see myself as, God forbid, adding upon Rashi's words. I don't see myself as responding to Rashi's words, rather only as adding upon them. So I just to drive home, of all people, specifically the Chizkuni, is pointing out that the Mishkan and the Mishkan and the Chet HaEgel are intrinsically tied, because he's operating in this Rashi world where, like Richard said, we're dealing with a kapara. We're dealing with some form of repentance for the Chet HaEgel, for the sin of the golden calf. And again, just to also emphasize this idea that what we're dealing with according to the Rashi approach is a response or a repentance, something that's influenced by the golden calf. We see an emphasis placed after the construction of the Mishkan on a very peculiar fact. Something you would think perhaps even goes against the ethos, against what we're building for. So because in Shemot 33 we see, Moshe took the tent of meeting, the meeting place with God, and he put it outside of the camp, far from the camp. And that's what he called the tent of meeting. And anyone who wanted God would go to the tent of meeting. And of course, we know the tent of meeting is the Mishkan, is the tabernacle. Sometimes it refers to a specific part of it. Sometimes it refers to all of it. But what we see is a focus on the need for distance from the Jewish people, the need to separate from them. And what those in the camp of Rashi, what the Meforshim and rabbis point out, is that this very easily could be viewed as one of the punishments and ramifications of the Chet HaEgel, of the golden calf. That we saw from the golden calf that the Jewish people couldn't be too close to God, that they weren't to be trusted with too much religious empowerment. So they needed to be separate, they needed to be spaced out, and to have some sort of system that would marshal and figure out when and how they can access God, ask questions, etc., etc., etc. So perhaps this is one more evidence that before that were it not for the golden calf, maybe everybody would have been so close, or maybe everybody would have been so close to God. But because of the golden calf, we need everyone to be far away from God and its distance. So that's just one more piece of evidence.
But doesn't this indicate that this particular pasuk 33:7, that the tent of meeting was already established, and therefore it may be the chronology according to the Rambam is actually correct, that it has already been established. In punishment for the Chet, which comes later, we're going to move we'll move it outside Chutz L'Machaneh, but it's already been established.
Interesting point. But I would thought from the fact he names it then would mean that this is the moment it's being established. Unless you think like he renames it, so like Rabbi, that it's been moved.
Rabbi, the fact that Moses excuse me, just to go back to your comment, the fact that Moses names it?
I say, we see here, it says, V'karalo o ha-moed. It was called, the verse names it. So
I was just clarifying your comment about that.
Sorry. Yeah. The fact the verse names it. Because you would assume the first time it's named is the first time it's introduced. So it's a good point that the fact that we see him moving it means it's there already. But maybe that just means from the previous verse where we heard about the building of the Mishkan, it was there already. Not from,
So that says to me that we need to go to God and God will meet us, but we need to go out of ourselves at some point to be able to go to, I mean, if the tent of the meeting is because outside the camp, which it is, and you can read it right there, we need to go to it in order for God to speak to us. That's what it says. And to me, because if it's in the middle of the camp, and he says, I will dwell within you. He doesn't say in the tent.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think really what Lindy's touching on here is that even if we want to say, oh, well, Moshe is dragging that tent really far away, there's a reason he could do that. That isn't just because the Jews sinned at the golden calf. No, maybe what we're just touching on, what we're just describing is some sort of theological ideal. You have to leave yourself, you have to go out, you have to make an effort. It shouldn't be too easy, it shouldn't be too mundane to view God. Maybe this isn't an evidence for anything. Maybe this is just how God views the way of communing with him, and that's also totally legitimate. I think perhaps of all the proofs we brought so far, this is amongst the weakest. But just to drive home one more proof, or less of a proof, but one more clear explication of this idea, we see that the Sforno tries to derive this idea from a creative read of some sukkim we saw together at the end of Yitro. So the Sforno says as follows in Shmot Chaf Daled Yud Chet in Exodus 20:14, source number 14 down below. Husag zeh ba'arba'im yom achronim. So just as context, the Sforno is discussing later on when Moshe is described as having karnei hod panav, karen or panav rather. He has rays of light on his, or rays of radiance on his face. And we know he puts a mask on in art that gets translated into horns, and there's the whole art history and anti-Semitic history of Jesus' horns. But that's what the Sforno is discussing. Moses' rays of light, or Moses' horns, whatever you want to call them. Moshe only merited these rays of light in the last trip up Har Sinai, the last time he went up Har Sinai. And it was on this last trip that Moshe was commanded about the Mishkan, not like the Ramban says the first time Moshe ascended the mountain, but rather the last time that Moshe ascends the mountain. Just like it says that he was told in the, so we see that in Shmot Chaf Hey, right? God says to Moshe, the El Ha'aron, to the ark, Titena Te'edut, give this testimony, the Torah, Asher Etena Lecha, which I'll give you, and this, which happens in Shmot Chaf Hey, didn't happen for the first set of luchot. Nowhere in the first set of luchot is there any talk about putting it on the Aron. And of course we understand why, because it's broken. So it's not until we get the second fixed set of luchot that both sets of luchot are told to be put into the ark. Fine. Fine. So like it says. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I skipped a line. Because they were broken. That's why God never told Moshe put these in the Aron until the second set are given. Komram, like the rabbis say, the tablets were broken, and its letters flew up into the air. This is the important part. Says the Sforno, Moshe was given the luchot, and then he broke them. Then the second time, Moshe was given the luchot, and he was told to put both sets of luchot into the Aron, into the ark, and that must have taken place later. Fine. So now to try and prove this, the Sforno quotes a midrash that says there's a fundamental difference between the first set of luchot and the second set of luchot. What's the midrash say? Otiot parchu, that certain letters flew off the first set of luchot and weren't on the second set of luchot. And we know that the rabbis say the first set of luchot had every question that would ever be asked from a student to a rabbi, all of Torah Sheba'al Peh. The second set of luchot only had Torah Shebechtav, the written Torah, and those are the letters that flew off. That's one interpretation. And there's all different comments in the rabbis why the letters flew off. But the Sforno, this is his interpretation. What's it mean the letters flew off the first set of luchot and weren't there for the second set of luchot? That there was some sort of fundamental difference between these luchot. So, and now he goes on to explain this. So that's why afterwards it says V'asuli mikdash v'shechanti b'tocham. Only after this luchot description do we have God tell the Jewish people in Terumah in our Parsha, make me a mikdash, make me a sanctuary, and I will reside in it. So lo k'moshe yad kodem lakein. It will not be like the plan was until now. Ka'amro, like we said earlier, Mizbeach Adamat Hasali, make me a dirt altar. Bechol hamakom asher ezkir et shemi avo elecha. Any place you mention my name, I will come to you. And the verse ends, uvirachticha, and bless you. In other words, says the Sforno, until now, we'd been operating under the assumption that anywhere we mention God's name, God will just appear. There's no need for a medium of a dedicated temple. But now with the breaking of the luchot, with the Chet HaEgel, with the things that occurred, some radical shift happened, and now God must be contained to v'shechanti b'tocham, to a specific place. Aval ata, but now yitztarech lekohanim. Now there's a need for priests, for intermediaries. V'zeh ba'atzmo hitzba'ar ba'amro v'atak revelechet aron achicha. And that is why now it's being addressed to Aaron the Kohanim, because now the priests are relevant factors. It's only after the Chet HaEgel. And as a proof of this, the Sforno points out, why were the Levites picked to serve in the temple? Because the Torah tells us the Levites didn't participate in the sin of the golden calf. So it must be, like we saw before, all of the parts of the Torah that deal with the Mishkan that are addressed to the Kohanim and the Levites, those must have taken place later too. But just what we get out of the Sforno, what we see from the Sforno, is that we have a radical shift, not just in the first luchot, the second luchot, the chronology, but in the theology here. That something major changes in Judaism, in the religion itself. In the first plan, initially, how did God view things? In Source Tet Vav, we saw together at the end of Parshat Yitro, when the luchot are first given, the Torah tells us, Mizbeach Adamat Haseli, God, all he needs is a dirt altar. You can sacrifice upon it. It doesn't have to be in a temple. It doesn't have to be centralized. It doesn't need gold, silver, kohanim, nothing. Go out to your backyard, make me a pile of dirt, and you can sacrifice. Anywhere you mention my name, I'll come to you. That's God's initial promise. But says the Sforno, when we get to Shemot Chafei, when we get to our Parsha, what's that promise transformed into? V'asuli mikdash. Make me a concrete physical structure, v'shechanti b'tocham. And there, that's where I can live. So it says this morning, we see already in the Psukim himself that God's presence is being minimized after the Egel. That after the sin of the golden calf, God can no longer meet the Jewish people in their backyard. Service can no longer be a free-for-all, a capricious, of the moment, when you feel it, build a dirt altar and sacrifice to God. But instead, We need a priestly class of intermediaries. We need a structured temple. We need temple service with rules. The Jewish people cannot be trusted to do things on their own. And that is a shift that takes place after the golden calf.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
The only thing you made a comment that to make a tent, to make the ark, to make the Mishkan, and I will dwell within it, but it doesn't say that. It says, that I know of, and they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst.
Yeah, exactly. That a sanctuary. But the point the Sforno makes is that the previous model of anywhere I'll say my name, God will come to me, that doesn't require any sanctuary. That doesn't require any space.
Okay, I get what you're saying. Okay.
It's the contrast there. So that's the Sforno's model. So the Sforno, I think, is a very beautiful illustration of Rashi's argument. But more than that, I really want to focus on the conceptual point the Sforno is trying to argue here. That what we're dealing with here is a shift in how our religion would be practiced and how the Jewish people would interface with God. Originally, we wouldn't have had a temple, we wouldn't have had a shul. We would have had a backyard mound, and everybody would have had individual access directly to God. Fundamentally different religion, different way of accessing God. I think it's so profound. And I want to explore that a little bit more and developing our own sense of understanding. What is the chronology? What exactly is going on here? What parallels are being drawn?
Actually, as a result of the destruction of the second temple, we've kind of gone back to much of the original plan.
What do you mean by that?
We don't have a Beis HaMikdash.
Yeah, it's a very
we meet God. Yes, you could go to shul, but if you can't, then you stay home and you meet in your room or wherever you are.
Yeah,
and we don't have to have the Kohanim. I mean, excuse me, Jeff. We don't really need the Kohanim to do much.
No, I think it's a very good point, and I think theologically there's a lot to think about. Theologically, maybe artistically. I'm not an artist, but there's a lot to think about. What does it mean if our experience of exile is living through the ideal without being equipped with the skills and character traits to actualize the ideal? What's that mean if that's exile? Perhaps exile is just developing the character traits to actualize the ideal. So that's something to think about. So I think that's a very powerful point. So thank you for raising that. But so just to review, what we have so far is we saw Rashi and Ramban, and we saw the conceptual two different models, and chronologically the two different models. So chronologically, Ramban thinks the commandment to build the tabernacle took place when Moshe first went up to the mountain, whereas Rashi thinks it took place at a later date after the sin of the golden calf. Conceptually, we pointed out for Rashi, what's that mean? What's the significance? What we're dealing with here is some form of repentance or some form of making up for the sin of the golden calf. And we have all of these parallels of needing a physical expression of God. That's why they built the golden calf. They needed some physical way to express their commitment. So God relented and said, fine, you need something physical, I'll give you this mikdash, but then you can't access me at home. You can't access me anywhere. You can only come to this mikdash and follow my rules, and that's how you'll access me. And we pointed out that conceptually, theologically, this can be viewed as a shift in the religion, that God saw that the Jewish people were incapable of living a life that was purely non-physical, purely spiritual. So he relented and gave them a temple and gave them the opportunity to repent for their sin with the golden calf. As a side note, because we don't have so much time, but that's a theme I just want us to think about that will be recurring again and again. The Jewish people are expected to not need physicality, and they cave and they need it. Moshe is told, don't hit the rock, don't put on a display, just talk to the rock. But instead he caves and he hits the rock and does a physical display, makes a visual performance. I think it's a similar theme. I think it's a theme we see a lot in the Torah, and less so, but also in Tanakh, that there's a significance of transitioning away from visual displays, from physical manifestations, to the verbal, intellectual, and communicative. So that's just something to sit on, just something to think about. But fine. If we have the Ramban's approach, though, on one hand, we understand on a basic level what we're trying to accomplish here. Every religion has a temple. It's nice to have some sort of centralized way to serve God. But Rovam Hadras Melech, it's better to have more people serve each other, etc. Fine. It's intuitive to have a temple and we don't have to justify it. But nonetheless, according to the Ramban, why is the temple story being mentioned here? Fine, strict chronology. Okay, why did God give us the commandment to build the temple here? Why didn't God wait until the resolution with the Egel HaZahav, with the second son of Lucha, with all these things? we still have to think about what is the lesson of the chronology, even if the chronology is historically significant. What is going on here? What are the conceptual or religious stakes of this story? So I wanted to put forth one potential understanding based on the Ramban. So to do that, I want to take a close look at the Psukim together. And we're not actually going to take that close of a look at the Psukim, because if anyone's done Shnaya Mikra or looked at the Psukim, they are super boring. It just goes and describes dimensions and materials and construction and how to build stuff. But I want to look at some of the themes and the structure of the Psukim, of the verses that come up over and over again together. So to that end, if we look now in Yud Zayin, we have our Parsha. So we know famously God says to go and collect Terumah, to collect a gift. And then we pick up here, after V'asu Mikdash, after God telling Moshe to build a structure, build a physical contained structure, he says in verse 9, Kechol asher ani mareh otcha, according with everything I will show you, 8 tamnit mishkan, the structure of the tabernacle, the 8 tamnit kol kelav, the structure of its kelim, of its vessels, v'chein tasu, and so you should do. In other words, says God to Moshe, I'm going to show you how to build it. I'm going to show you how to build all of it. And we know that the rabbis pick up on this, and most famously, they pick up on this in the context of the menorah, of the lamp in the tabernacle. And the rabbis say in the Midrash that God showed Moshe how to build it out of the fiery vision. Moshe had a vision of exactly what the tabernacle would look like, and that taught him how to build it. But on the most simplest level, we see God showed Moshe basically everything. He showed him the kelim, the vessels, and the mishkan, the structure. He showed him how to build all those things. And then from there, the Torah goes and lists each one of the vessels. And then finally, towards the end, it says, Vasita menorah zahav tahor. You should make the menorah. Mikshet haseh menorah. You shall make it a miksha. We won't go into what that means. Complicated question. Yeah, you're chafan, etc., etc. And then the menorah ends, like the commandment to build the menorah ends. Ura'eh, see the aseh and do b'tav nitam in your work. Asher atam mareh bahar, that which you saw on the mountain. And of course, the rabbis and all the commentators pick up. What's it mean, the thing that Moshe saw on the mountain? It must be that while still on Har Sinai, God showed Moshe an image of what the menorah is supposed to look like, and perhaps even an image of what all of the kelim are supposed to look like. So we see, one, an emphasis between Har Sinai, the experience on the mountain, and the experience of building the tabernacle. That we have an emphasis that the things that are being built for the tabernacle, for the Mishkan, were given specifically on Har Sinai, and more than that, they were seen in Har Sinai. Like the kolot, like the sounds and the miraculous experience of Har Sinai, they were part of it. Moshe saw that on the mountain. But then we continue, beyond the kelim, beyond the vessels being seen in Har Sinai, what else do we see at Har Sinai? V'et mishkan taseh, you should make the actual structure of the tabernacle. And then from there we hear about the yeriot, about the cloth and the poles and the beams. And then 30 verses later it ends, V'akimote to Mishkan, you should erect the tabernacle, Kemishpato, according to its laws, Asher Harita Bahar, that God taught Moshe on the mountain. Again, we have another emphasis on one, Harita, showing the visual see that Moshe saw on the mountain how to build the Mishkan. So another emphasis tying, not just chronologically, but thematically and textually, we want to tie together the idea of Har Sinai and the revelation of Sinai with the building of the Mishkan. All of this is happening at the same time on the mountain, and that's important to emphasize. And more than that, we see that one, the kelim, the vessels, were emphasized as being from Har Sinai. Two, the structure is from Har Sinai. But then we have this unusual section. But right after we hear about the building of the vessels and the building of the Mishkan, and you would think, oh, okay, we're done. We then hear Vasita Parochet, make a curtain. Tchelet Bargaman, etc. And you should put it on these poles. Etc. And we learn about the parochet, about the various covers and dividers that divide the Jewish people from the Kodesh HaKodashim and from the Aron, from the Holy of Holies and from the Ark. But there we have no mention of anything being so commanded on the mountain. It doesn't say anything about it. It just ends Vesita l'masach, and you should make it as a screen, blah blah blah, and do it. And then we have a parsha and a space. And then Vasita to Mizbeach, make the altar. Da 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 da, and the altar ends. Make sure to do it like you saw on the mountain. So again, we pick up right again after hearing about the need to make this mass that divides the Jewish people, And we say, oh yeah, by the way, you should also make a golden altar. And you should also, when you make this altar, make sure it's like I showed you on the mountain. Then we see Vasita et Chatzar HaMishkan. Now we have a commandment not to build the physical structure of the Mishkan, not to build kelim for the Mishkan, but to make sure there's space for a courtyard. Lefat Negev Teimana in the southern corner, etc. And make sure you have silver, blah, 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 blah. No mention of Har Sinai, no mention of God's previous commandment. So to review, because we just ran through this quickly, in our section, dealing with the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, we have an emphasis placed on the fact that God showed Moshe how to build this on Har Sinai. And that makes sense. One, with the strict chronology we pointed out, that this is following on the heels of the giving of the Torah on Har Sinai. And two, with the overall Ramban thematic story that says intentionally it was right after Har Sinai. The point is to link this to Har Sinai. The tabernacle and Har Sinai, for some reason, should be intrinsically linked, and it has nothing to do with the Chet HaEgel. This is not in the Rashi world. So that's what we pointed out. So now when we look in the Psukim, what do we see specifically is emphasized and linked to Har Sinai? Construction of the Kelim, specifically the menorah and the Mizbeach, construction of the walls and the structure of the Mishkan. And what is not at all tied to Har Sinai? Oh, and of course, lastly, the Mizbeach. And what isn't at all tied to Har Sinai? The construction of a divider between the Kodesh HaKodashim, the construction of a cover on top of the Aron, and the Chatzer, the courtyard. So I want to recall that when we learned together about Har Sinai, about the giving of the Torah, we pointed out that one of the emphases in Har Sinai is about the Hagbalot, about the various divisions of Har Sinai. And the theory we put forth that I mentioned at the beginning of Shir, but just to review, was that the initial plan was that the Har Sinai experience would prepare the Jewish people for actual face-to-face confrontation and acceptance of the Torah with God. But unfortunately, the Jewish people weren't able to. And they told Moshe, we can't do this, and God and Moshe called an audible, and Moshe served as an intermediary. And we pointed out that to some extent, that sets the tone for everything that happens later. Because right afterwards, God, realizing what's going on, gets nervous and says, don't make any golden idols. And then, of course, we know what happens. They go and they make golden idols because they have this lacking of face-to-face intimacy. They don't see God. They're not sure God is really there. This sets the tone for the future relationship with the Jewish people. I think what we see here is that it's not that the Mishkan is a kapara for the Chet HaEgel. The Mishkan is a reflection of the Jewish people's relationship with God. And the Jewish people's relationship with God is put on display, is most clearly illustrated at Har Sinai, at Revelation. And whereas we thought Revelation was going to be an experience where we'd all be up on the mountain, we'd all be able to experience that revelation, what ultimately happened was that all of us were distant. So up on the mountain, what does Moshe hear about? Well, Moshe hears about the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies the Jewish people will get to see. And he hears about the amazing Kelim, that the Jewish people will walk into the Holies and they'll see personally, they'll take their animal and they'll slaughter an animal to God, because they were the ones who were commanded face to face. Moshe hears about all of the sanctified parts in the Mikdash. Oh, but we haven't heard about the Kohanim yet. We haven't heard about the Leviim yet. Of course, because this is the theoretical model. This is the model where every person has access to God, where there's no need for a priest. There's no need for a Levite. It's not that it's anachronous, that's out of order, it's out of time. It's that we're being told here what Moshe was told on the mountain. And the initial plan, of course, didn't account for that. But eventually, what we see, the way it develops, after the Jewish people refuse to meet God at the end of Yitro, there's now a need for intermediaries. So while it might be true, we haven't yet learned the full history of the priests yet, God tells Moshe, make sure there's intermediaries involved. Make sure there's Kohanim, there's Leviim, etc. So also, we see that the parts of the Mishkan that are purely secular, that don't have a Kodesh, a holy purpose, but rather serve to separate the Jewish people from Kedusha, to separate the Jewish people from holiness, those were never mentioned on the mountain because they were never supposed to exist. The Chatzer, the courtyard where the Jewish people can stand outside and watch the Kohanim do service from afar, God didn't mention that on the mountain. Ideally, that shouldn't have happened. The Jewish people should have been inside, just like they should have been on the mountain. The cover that separates the Kodesh HaKodashim, the holiest of holies, that covers the Aron, that makes it even harder to see the Ark, those shouldn't have been there because we should have been so close to God that we didn't need them. So what we see is the emphasis here on tying it to Har Sinai is not because something about Har Sinai forever changed how it should be expressed because of the Chet HaEgel, because we sinned, but it's because Har Sinai is our expression of our relationship with God. So when we didn't manifest a relationship with God that was one-to-one, where we saw God face to face, we manifested in a different way. And that's what the Torah is coming to tell us. So when we look and we see the differences between what was on the mountain and what came later, we can now appreciate the Torah is indicating to us some things were originally planned. Some things had to be adapted when the Jewish people didn't rise to the call and go up on the mountain. And what we ultimately see is that we have a position somewhere between the Ramban and Rashi. On the one hand, we preserve the chronology like the Ramban does, and we say what we have here is a literal chronological narrative. But on the other hand, like Rashi, we view the Har Sinai moments as a significant theological shift in how Judaism will be expressed and practiced. Originally, we were all supposed to go up the mountain, but when we don't, there's a need for the Mishkan to reflect the change for the Jewish people's failure. So I think what we can see now is a little bit of clarity surrounding why is this story being put here, why is it emphasizing Har Sinai, and what's all the confusion surrounding the chronology. I hope that made sense. I'm interested in what people think, as always, for the next few minutes, and we're a bit over, sorry. As always, feel free to call, text, reach out, email me, let me know if you agree, disagree, and thank you everybody for coming and learning tonight. Have a good night, everybody.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
I really thought about that. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
For sure. Yeah, think about it. Let me know.
It makes sense when you think about it. If we were when the people said, "Okay, we've heard enough. You go speak to them," they then put the wall.
Exactly. Yeah.
Created the wall. We created our own wall.
We created our own walls. Exactly. Yeah. It's very moving.
The inability to be able to. I mean, I don't know what we would have done if we would have been there at the same. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm glad it's food for thought. All right. Thank you everybody for coming.